Watercolor is a pretty accessible medium. You don't need a whole lot of supplies in order to get started with this. You'll need some paint, which come in pan, tubes, or liquid form. You'll need some paint brushes. Even the $3 cheap ones are just fine. You'll need a paper towel to dry off your brushes and lift off paint from your paper. You need some scratch paper to test your colors, some water. I like 2 cups, one for rinsing brushes and one to add clean water to your paint, and then you'll need some paper. I really like the Strathmore 400 series. Any watercolor paper should do just fine. It needs to be thick and cottony and heavy because that's how it will stay, it will keep from warping with the paint. You don't need fancy watercolors to get started with this medium. You can get a wide range by mixing these basic colors in the student palette. Don't worry if it's a little bit messy. Just a little water and wipe it out. You can get rid of the muddiness. Use water to activate the color. The more I mix my brush around in the color, the richer the color will be. You can mix colors together on your tray, and if you want it to be lighter, you can always add a little bit of water to it. The first principle of watercolor is that color goes where water flows. Remember that when working with this medium that can sometimes have a mind of its own. Water activates the color. Color will stay within the boundaries of where you put the water on your paper. The more water you use, the more your paint will flow. And if you want to soften colors, you use water. The first technique to know is the wash. A wash is just an area of semi-transparent watercolor. It can be done in a very large area or much smaller and more defined areas. You can make a wash by wetting your paper first with fresh, clean water and then dropping in the paint like I did in that first example. The water pulls the color around and it won't go outside the wet boundary. The second way to do a wash is by painting your pre-wetted color right onto the paper. You can soften and pull it around with a wet, clean brush. Next, I'm doing something called charging. See how I'm painting a few more defined areas with clear water? Then I just drop or charge the color in and it stays within the water boundary. I can even use a second color and kind of charge them together, which allows them to merge and blend. You don't have to overwork it here. The splotches and variations in the color is what makes this medium interesting. To demonstrate the difference between charging color into a wet boundary and blending directly on the paper, I'll do 2 simple spheres. For the first one, I will carefully wet the entire circle with water. You need enough water that there's a little sheen on the paper, but not so much that there's a big puddle. Then I load my brush with lots of color and just stroke it in. The water will pull it outward even after I stop painting. I'm adding more color to get deeper, more vibrant shades and to create the illusion of a shifting shadow on a rounded surface. The color bleeds and flows, but it will stay inside the wet boundary. For the second one, I stroke the color directly on dry paper, then rinse my brush and soften the edges. With watercolor, you have to reserve your whites. You can do something called lifting out, which I'll show you right here, by using a clean paper towel to lift off the damp paint. But for bright white highlights, you need to leave it unpainted. After the spheres are dry, you can see the difference between the 2 approaches. Which do you prefer? It's really a matter of preference rather than right or wrong. Remember how color goes where water flows? I'll demonstrate this here. I've got my flower sketch nicely drawn in pencil. I'm going to fill in that entire shape with clean, fresh water. And then I'll activate my color with water on my palette. See how I'm just charging the color directly into the petals. If I paint a wet boundary next to another wet boundary, those colors will mix together on my paper. Sometimes you might want this effect, but other times you might want to keep them separate. If you want to keep them separate, you need to wait until one wet boundary is dry, like this flower. I can add the leaf color, and even though the leaf boundary touches the flower boundary, it will not bleed together since the flower area is totally dry. I'm charging some deeper blue into the leaf boundary to get some interesting variation here. I'm also using a lifting out technique to lighten some areas of the leaf. Yellow in the center will stay in its own boundary since the petals have totally dried. I can also go back in with more of that orangey red on the flower and get some added dimension or detail there. This is called glazing. Watercolor is transparent, so you'll be able to see color underneath when you layer them together. Glazing is a really good way to get deeper colors and add some more defined details. Think of watercolor like stained glass. When you overlap them, you get a third color that's a mixture of the two. You can see what it looks like when I layer the same color orange, then an analogous color red, and complementary blue.